Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about the importance of geoeconomics. This event today is part of FPRI's Main Line series, and we would like to thank our Main Line series co-chairs, Eileen Rosenau, John Piasecki, and James Gately. We'd also like to thank the Haverford School and its headmaster, Dr. John Nagl, for hosting the event. A little bit about John Nagl, whom most of you probably know. He's the head of the Haverford School. He's also a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army on the team that produced the U.S. Army and Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual. He's also the author of Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, Counterinsurgency Lessons from Malaya and Vietnam. This afternoon, if you have questions, we'll be taking your questions. So please put them down in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box. Also, I'd just like to give a shout out for an upcoming book talk on April 29th from 2 to 3 p.m. It will be the new book by Jacques Delisle, FPRI's Asia Program Director, and his co-author Avery Goldstein, who will discuss their new book, After Engagement, which addresses the recent changes in American assessment of China's capabilities and intentions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John Nagl.
Thanks, Raleigh, and thanks to all of you for joining us in this session of the Main Line Briefings. And here on the Main Line, we are seeing some pretty dramatic weather, so hopefully the thunderstorms will not interfere with our session. We are talking geoeconomics today with Professor Mark Duckenfield of the Army War College. Mark has been chairman of the Department of National Security and Strategy there since October of 2015. He previously taught at the Air War College in Maxwell, Alabama, and slightly less luxurious accommodations at the London School of Economics and University College London. Mark has written a bunch of academic articles on gold, financial crises, and international political economy. He's the author of the book Business and the Euro. His other books include A Monetary History of Gold, The History of Financial Disasters, which is actually a story about my financial investments during the pandemic, and Battles Over Free Trade, Anglo-American Experiences with International Trade, 1776 to 2006. His more recent research is focused on the economics of national security. And as Raleigh mentioned, as we go through, if you would put your questions for Mark in the Q&A box, I will read them to him. And at this point, I would like to invite Mark to present his official disclaimer.
Thank you very much, John. And for my disclaimer, while I work at the Army War College, the opinions that I express are my own. They're not those of the Army, the War College, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
But they are nonetheless interesting, entertaining, and will help you make good financial decisions by the end of this talk. I had to say something cheery because it's about to get really bleak in here, Mark. As regular participants know, we have a history of really cheery discussions here in this forum. And so I'd like to read some of your words in a recent note to me back to you. And you described the international situation as, quote, a fraying of Western multilateral institutions in general. Mark, are we all doomed?
Well, I don't think we're doomed. I think that would certainly be overdoing it, but we're entering challenging times and more challenging times than have typically been the case. But by the same token, I think promising times as well, because we're starting to dig ourselves out of the problems that we had been in over the last, say, 4 to 8 years. I think we seem to be emerging from a very real and dangerous, I think, challenge to the multilateral institutions that I had referred to. And by those, I mean the institutions governing world trade, world monetary affairs, international development and world health. And I think those came under a great deal of stress, a great deal of challenge that's still there, but I think we've started to move somewhat in the right direction. But in some ways, there still is continued possibilities and prospects of backsliding and more worrisome developments.
And Mark, you spoke quite professorially in the passive voice in that answer. What caused this backsliding to happen? What were the causes of these problems?
Well, I think some of the things that people point to as causes are really more the symptoms. It's not the rise of Donald Trump or populism or British or European concerns about immigration or Brexit and so forth. There is a sort of underlying legitimate concern among a large number of people, particularly in the developed world, who've seen the old promises of prosperity, development, opportunity being eroded by globalization. And our elites and our governments have struggled to try and come up with policies that can, in the developed world, provide more broad-based opportunities. We see this manifesting itself in debates about inequality and the increasing gap between the wealthiest of the population and normally I would say the poorest, but increasingly a very big mass of people. And that is the big challenge that we're facing. I think it's not insurmountable. I think we can move in a direction that remedies this, but all of those have created political pressures, and our governments are, in the advanced industrial democracies, are responsive in broad terms to popular pressures. And you see that manifesting itself in ways that are starting to isolate or have started to isolate governments and countries from broader international trends. And I think in the broadest sense to their detriment. But hopefully we can start moving in a way where we can move collaboratively forward, but also mutually address these inequalities and these lack of opportunities that persist not just in the United States, but across many countries.
It seemed to me there that you described globalization as a bad thing. Can you define globalization for those who might, or give your definition of globalization for those who might not be familiar, and then assess the impact of globalization on global economics?
Well, I would call globalization the increased exposure of domestic societies, including economies, cultures, to international forces, whether they're market forces or cultural forces or labor forces, migrant labor, and so forth. That would be how I would describe globalization. And to a large measure, I find it a good thing, but it's something that needs to be managed and the downsides ameliorated. And you can see this in concerns, not just in the United States, where we have concerns about undocumented workers, migrants, and legal immigration, but also in Europe as well, between what the parlance in Britain are, that it's, so-called asylum seekers or economic migrants.
And in general, who does globalization help, or what category of individuals, companies, countries does it help, and which ones does it hurt?
Well, for the last 20 years, 30 years, it's really helped the people at the very top of the pyramid, but also a large number of people in the poorest countries of the world. One of the big promises really throughout the post-war period of the American global system was that opening your markets and trading more with other people wouldn't help just the United States and its relatively wealthy allies, although it did. It would give its biggest benefits to the poorest countries of the world as their economies would converge on those of the developed world. And after many fits and starts, from about the mid-1990s onwards, that has largely been what has happened for many countries, and most noticeably with China, but we see it in other countries as well. As they've industrialized, that gap is closed, and the people in the manufacturing sectors of these newly industrialized countries are ones that are largely moving into sectors of the economy that a industrial working class in Western Europe and the United States had previously occupied, and those professions are eroding, and many of those people or their children are struggling to be able to make ends meet or to achieve the standards of living that they had hoped for and aspired to. So in the last 20 or 30 years, there have been big beneficiaries, poorer people in the developing world, much wealthier people in the developed world, but it's put a squeeze on what we've traditionally seen as in the United States, what we call the middle class, although working classes started to come more into our vernacular, and what in Europe was seen as the traditional working class.
And give a couple of sentences on why that is. Break that down for me. So the working class has been hurt by globalization in what industries and why?
Well, most of the industries that were very labor intensive, that required working with your hands, working in factories, large elements of manual labor, as these became either mechanized, and the machines have taken a lot of jobs, or put and more easily traded to countries where workers will work for less, and being able to compete in the same way that workers from Lancashire in the United Kingdom couldn't compete with workers from South Carolina. Workers from South Carolina have difficulty competing with workers from Indonesia or Vietnam or China. And so there is this shift of labor-intensive jobs from the wealthy countries that have higher wages to relatively poorer but labor-rich countries with lower wages. So the people who get lots of money are the ones that have skills that don't require them necessarily to be working on the shop floor. They're the ones who are designing things, or who are managing the operations of big companies, or who are professors in universities. And those people very often, because their jobs are secure and they're often seen as the elites, or the particularly well-accessed individuals, are often not as empathetic as perhaps they otherwise would be with the rest of the population in the developed countries. And there's a tension there. You see it in this anti-elite, resistance to the traditional groups that have been in charge, because they've failed a lot of people. They haven't come up with solutions that make people's lives better, at least not in the last 20 to 30 years.
And what word would you use to describe then the phenomenon of those formerly working class, perhaps often unionized workers who have seen their livelihoods disappear? Is that what's contributing to nationalism, which you mentioned briefly?
Well, yeah, there certainly is some, and it has an international dimension, and it can also have a domestic element as well, as groups within countries see themselves in if the pie is not expanding so rapidly for them, they're fighting within their own country for a bigger share of a shrinking pie. So we often will call this populism or nationalism, but it can manifest itself in domestic conflict as well, between groups that are traditionally in versus traditionally out. We certainly see this very often in our country along racial lines, for example.
And was this some of the mechanism that drove Brexit? And can I get you to talk about Brexit within the context of the European Union and sort of the ebb and fall?
Yes, I think very much so. You see a big element of migration and fears that East Europeans in particular were migrating under the auspices of the European Union, where you had free movement of labor, and Poles, Romanians, Lithuanians could move to London or elsewhere and work in the same way that British citizens could go to Spain or Germany and elsewhere and work. And there also was concern about asylum seekers from North Africa, Syria, and elsewhere that were coming in, putting a burden on the social services, challenging issues of law and order. And Europe in the British parlance was seen as being the cause of this, that, Britain was an island and these Europeans were making rules that were letting people come into Britain, that were changing the fabric of British society in a way that was undesirable. Now, often this harkened back to a golden age that never was. There was a lot of, rhetoric about the Second World War, of whom the big boogeyman remains, even though this was, now 75 years in the past. The Germans, and the Germans were seen as at the center of the European project, and the British like nothing more, whether it's in football or the Olympics or whatever, to beat up on the Germans, and the same in politics as well. So setting Britain as a global Britain against Europe was part and parcel of that, of a nationalist reaction, that if really we had control of our own affairs, we would be able to get better deals in trade, we'd be able to keep out undesirable people, and we would be better off.
And how has that worked out for Her Majesty's government?
Well, I think it's worked out very poorly. It's still in the early stages, and the pandemic has overlapped on top of it. The pandemic has in many ways dwarfed the consequences of Brexit in the short term, but in the long term, Brexit will be much more seriously affecting the British economy, because now companies that used to invest in Britain because they had ready access to the European market will invest instead in Belgium or Germany or Spain, because they don't have to worry about the uncertainty of crossing borders. But one of the biggest blunders, I would say, of this, and it was entirely predictable, stems also back to the issues of nationalism, but not British nationalism per se, but Irish nationalism. And being part of the European Union had allowed Britain to paper over the troubles that it had in Northern Ireland, where 40% of the population, who was Catholic, wanted to be unified with the Southern Catholic Irish Republic, and the 55 to 60% who were Protestant very firmly wanted to be unionist and part of the United Kingdom, but were a bit wary because they were on the island of Ireland, and they were always worried that they were going to be sold out. But when everyone was part of the European Union and you could move back and forth easily, if you were an Irish Catholic, you could go from Belfast down to Dublin. There was no border, wasn't in your face that you weren't part of Ireland, and you could have an Irish passport, and everyone had a European Union passport. So that was pretty easy. And for the Unionists, the Protestants, you were part of the United Kingdom. You could go anywhere else in Europe just like everyone else, but you were still British, and it wasn't a problem. And this had very much facilitated 20 years of peace in Northern Ireland. And it's starting to come unraveled, because with Britain out of the European Union, you have to have a border. Now, where's the border going to be drawn? In Ireland. If you draw it on the mainland of Northern Ireland, then there's a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic and the whole rest of the island. And the British and the Irish have agreed there shouldn't be any hard border, because that causes problems. But if then you have a border of sorts when you ship goods from Northern Ireland to the United Kingdom, the Protestants and the Unionists are going to say, hey, why should we have to cross a border within our own country? That's made us outside our own country. We're foreigners in our own country, which means we're not really part of the country. So it's a quandary that now has become quite stark with the Brexit. And they're still trying to work it out. And there's some other things that go on top of it, that some of the Protestant loyalist groups were very heavily involved in organized crime, and having borders is occasionally a little difficult for organized crime. So, they chafe at this as well, but can create trouble around nationalist issues, even if their financial interests are, somewhat divergent from that, for example.
So this is the kind of gloom and doom we like to have in these conversations.
Yes, then that would be a more gloom and doom
with
aspect of it.
That has real hard security implications as well. But we'll leave it there and move perhaps then across the channel to the continent, where a huge part of England's power, the United Kingdom's power and strength in the world, came from its status as a global financial center. How is that being affected by Brexit, and where is it going?
Well, it's certainly been eroded somewhat. A lot of the London still remains one of the premier, if not the premier, financial center, depending upon the trading area, the premier area in the world. But that's sort of becoming eroded as well, because now they're outside Europe and European regulations, outside the United States, and it can have some advantages. But if you were wanting to have and sell lots of mortgages or make loans to companies in the European Union, when Britain was part of the European Union, that was very easy. They were all under the same set of regulations. Now, theoretically, British banks, British financial houses, the merchant banks could be blocked or otherwise regulated in the manner in which they interact on the continent. There's no agreement yet on how that would work. And this is the biggest and most profitable sector of the British economy. So this means very serious business for them. It's not going to be the doom and gloom of London, but it could shift a certain amount of business towards, say, Frankfurt, Milan, Paris, where they're quite comfortably within the European Union and they don't have to worry about any differences in British and European regulations and requirements. And also, if you're part of the European Union, you get into trouble, then at least you're within a common system of how you deal with that. Now, if a British bank gets into trouble, well, maybe the British government bails them out or does something, but it'll be under different terms and arrangements than might happen within the European Union itself.
We're getting some terrific questions, and I'm going to get to them. I'm going to just keep moving. I'm moving east right now. I'm going to keep moving east, and we will end up back in the United States, and there's some great questions there. But so it sounds as if Brexit has not been spectacular for the UK. How has it been for Europe?
Well, I mean, Britain's a smaller player for Europe as a whole than Europe is for Britain, the sizes being what they are. Still, it's a major player, as was one of the three largest economies. So there is certainly some interruption, particularly with France and the Low Countries and Germany and Ireland in particular. So there have been some disruptions there that, and the Irish in particular would prefer it be as little as possible. So there have been some adjustments they're going to have to make. And on the international in the international system, when they're coming to negotiate agreements, sometimes that's going to have some downsides. Some areas within the European political system, when they have to negotiate a trade agreement, might find their position strengthened compared to where they were. Britain never had much of a farming sector under the European Union, so when they would come up with trade agreements, the British weren't always so keen on protecting the European Common Agricultural Policy. But you remove Britain, a big country with not many farmers, then the countries that are left, their farmers are proportionately more powerful. And so that would make farming as an element of a trade agreement more difficult from a European perspective. And so broadly speaking, it probably strengthens the countries that would want slightly more restrictive trade measures, although not entirely. The British, like everyone else, had areas of the economy that they wanted to protect and weren't as keen to let foreign competition into as well. So in some areas there's a wash, but you could identify some particular sticking points, of which agriculture would be one of the major ones, that British absence has made the European policies a little less balanced towards openness.
And net Brexit economic loss to the UK, gain to the EU?
No, loss to both. More of a loss to the UK because well over half of their trade is with Europe, and it's gone from being no trade barriers to trade barriers in some areas and not in others. That's going to raise prices, make deliveries less timely. And the Europeans, although Britain was a smaller portion of their trade, it will still affect them as well. And there'll be some adjustments over the next 5 to 10 years because people have built big manufacturing plants in Britain designed to integrate their operations within Europe. And some of those will now have to move to other countries because the uncertainty of trading across borders or going through customs controls they didn't used to will make it less efficient for them to operate. So there'll be a negative effect on Europe, but smaller than that within the United Kingdom.
So you're a committed free trader through and through. Free trade really does lift all boats.
It does, although, I mean, that being said, there are ways to manage it so that the adjustments don't fall so heavily on people and sectors. You want, but this, I wouldn't put this burden on the trade side of it so much as on the domestic welfare state for, retraining workers, providing support to industries and communities that are losing out from international competition. That the vagaries of international competition being what they are, some industries are going to rise and fall. Shipbuilding's not so big in Hamburg anymore. The textile industry is out of South Carolina and Massachusetts. Automobiles are out of Texas, but there's still a lot of workers and a lot of people who lived in those towns and communities. So how can you prepare them for the future? Do you make it easy for them to move to where other jobs are? Do you provide training for different occupations where they are, support for attending community and vocational college to get new skills? These are all very difficult questions. So while I certainly think trade is very beneficial, it enables people to get goods cheaper, and that particularly benefits people at the lower end of the socioeconomic system. At the same time, you want to be able to provide jobs and opportunities for people at the lower end of the social economic system as well, especially as you deal with all of these changes they're exposed to. And that's one area that across the board, Western countries have been challenged by, but it's not one we're unaware of. I mean, when you and I were younger, John, you would recall Bill Clinton was elected president with an education platform against George H.W. Bush, who proclaimed himself the education president. And very much of that was a clear awareness that American workers weren't going to be able to compete, hour for hour on the factory floor. They had to be able to compete at the intellectual and skill level, rather than straight out on the manual labor and price level.
Mm-hmm. And the question section is starting to get chippy. I'm getting to China, guys. Really, I am. We'll get there. But just a couple of stops first. First, I note that I failed to pin you down early with the definition of geoeconomics, and in particular, as opposed to geopolitics. So please.
Well, I think with geoeconomics, it's very similar to geopolitics, but one which emphasizes the economic instruments of power and the economic opportunities and advantages that countries might have based upon their geographic location or the geographic attributes of where they are. You can see it anywhere from something as banal as the Suez Canal, right? I mean, that's a obvious.
We thought it was banal, but we found out it wasn't.
Yes, well, it's a huge geoeconomic advantage until it gets clogged, and then all of a sudden you have to start figuring, well, what do you need? What sort of things would it be good to have? Ready access to a sophisticating dredging industry seems to be of great value, for instance, and being able to get those resources quickly in line. But that's both and you can see the geopolitical implications as well, which certainly have been obvious since the British took over the Suez Canal in the 1870s and then lost it and tried to get it back. And so that, so they are quite intertwined.
Okay. I do want to get to China, but I'm going to make one more stop along the way. I'm looking at Russia and Russia's economic position, both and its ability to influence, for instance, Germany with the Nord Stream project.
Yeah.
And use natural resources in order to exert geopolitical influence. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the Germans have started to, back away from this, and it's not anything new. Going back to the Cold War and the Russian, the Soviet pipeline to Western Europe, the Reagan administration always feared that in a cold winter, the Soviets would turn off the gas and, hold Western Europe hostage. It never happened. The Russians are just as dependent upon the Germans paying them as the Germans are for the gas. And with the expansion of liquefied natural gas and so forth, the Russian hold is weaker, but still to the former Soviet space, a lot of the pipelines still lead back into Russia. And that gives them a certain degree of leverage. But the thing with sanctions or as economic influence, you're also sanctioning yourself when you sanction someone. And if it's a relatively small industry to you, that's fine. But if it's your biggest industry and you're pretty dependent on it, as the Russians are on the export of oil and gas, if you decide to run into some difficulties with the Germans, okay, but if the Germans are probably better able to stop paying you than you are to stop receiving German money. The Russians need to have a certain price of oil and gas to fund their overseas adventures as well. So the Russians at the same time want to have a certain degree of stability, which isn't to say they might not have other things going. You can obviously see the buildup in the Ukraine and Syria. The Ukraine's quite close to home, and I think the Russians there in Belarus and Georgia have very much seen that this, the bad events there could have some repercussions in Red Square, not simply elsewhere, and that the survival of their, or making trouble for people who make trouble for them can strengthen their domestic position. But I see it as very much a sign of Russian weakness rather than Russian strength. And just over a decade ago, Ukraine was a Russian client state, and now the Russians have pocketed Crimea, and they've got a war that's costing them money in the Ukraine, and 2/3 of the Ukraine absolutely hates them. And that doesn't strike me as it's not a better position than they were in a decade ago.
Mm-hmm. I'll just note in passing, for those who haven't seen the news, huge demonstrations in Moscow and I think across Russia today and tonight. It's tonight there now in support of Navalny, who remains alive but hospitalized in his hunger strike against Putin's government. And on balance, Russia a rising or a falling power geoeconomically and geopolitically, Mark?
Oh, I think it's been falling for some time. The areas in which they have any strength are highly statist areas, nuclear power, military sales, and natural resources, all very capital intensive, require frequent degree of state intervention, both in foreign markets and in building the infrastructure, negotiating the infrastructure. It's very much still a legacy from the old Soviet playbook, which was, elements from the old Tsarist playbook of centralized control, but very little in the way of smaller, more adept industries and a more diverse economy. There's so much money to be made in in the natural gas and minerals field, that there's really not much opportunity to be making, profitable enterprises elsewhere. If you want to make a lot of money, it's pretty easy to do it in a few clear areas, especially if you have political connections.
I was going to say and those investments help the government,
Yeah,
in a way that smaller sort of manufacturing jobs do not, as is the case in China, which is sort of the opposite of Russia, right? Deficient in natural resources, except for a highly productive, highly skilled workforce. And we've got a question from Jerry Rubenstein on, is China the world's, America's biggest, China's the America's or the West's biggest geoeconomic threat right now?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. It's certainly a challenge, and it cuts both ways. It's both geoeconomic and geopolitical. And the bet for 20 years had been that, well, we encourage markets to open in China, to liberalize the economy, it'll create a middle class. Middle class people will, they'll demand freedom and greater autonomy, and this will put some pressure, if not to democratize China, at least move it towards some soft authoritarianism like, say, Singapore or something. And I think we've seen that actually has not been panning out. And if I were, on the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Beijing over the last 20 or 30 years, and I heard that coming out of the West, that sounds a whole lot like regime change. But the Chinese bet has been, no, firm hand at the center on the tiller. We can allow, economic liberalization, but people have got to politically, shut up and do their work. And so far, they've been able to do that. They've been winning that bet. And their arrangement, if you will, with the peopleist Communist Party delivers. We've had greater growth, moved more people out of poverty than has ever occurred in the history of the world. And who's done it? Chinese Communist Party's done it. And look at these fractious Westerners who are always getting into trouble. And their economies are going kaput and all this other stuff. That's the counter, at least that's the propaganda and the rhetoric. And they have a great deal of control over the media. They're not getting FPRI broadcasts out of Shanghai being critical of the regime. They're getting a pretty clear message that can mix nationalism, it can mix the economic program of the leadership, and they don't have to have elections or an opposition party to, be critical. So it's a pretty powerful brew.
So you're a fan of authoritarian governments
No, I'm not. I'm not. I'm just commenting that in this regard, they're pretty effective at doing what they want. But keep in mind what they're costing their population. I think in terms of political freedom, choices about where to live, how to live, what you do, those are big losses to people, or potential losses. But keep in mind, and China's grown so much in the last 2 decades. Most of the people around in China would say, "Well, look where I was 2 decades ago. Life's a whole lot better than what it was." And the 200 million people who've moved from the countryside where they might not have had electricity into cities, where instead of having to get up at 4 a.m. and work a 16-hour day, they might work a 10 or 12-hour day, but they're living frequently in an air-conditioned apartment building that's much better than what they might have experienced growing up as a child or as a teenager. So from their point of view, this is a massive, massive improvement.
You make it sound quite appealing.
Well, it's a rapid development of a country that had been mired in poverty under the Communist Party, by the way, and its predecessors, but for 30 or 40 years. But the one thing they run the risk of not being able to do is being able to respond to and adjust to economic crisis and pressure. one of the responses democratic societies have, a way of sort of, venting, if you will, is you vote your government out, and then they become the bad guys of the past, and the new government comes in and says, we will try and solve the problem. And that's not really an option in China. So you get things like, they're not sustained campaigns like you have in the West, but you have much more incidences of violence, one-off incidents of violence, riots, workplace demonstrations in China, as people have a lot of pent-up anger about things, usually land seizures in villages where they're expanding to put in factories, concerns about the environment.
It is in fact Earth Day, and we know that China is participating in the President Biden's Global Climate Change Summit. Can you talk to your concerns, if you have any, about climate change as an economic threat to China, which I believe is the world's biggest emitter at this point?
I think it is, because it's now the most industrialized country. But by the same token, one of the markets they're trying to move towards are alternative energy. Now, they may or may not get it right. It's a sort of state-directed endeavor, but they are trying to gravitate away, because there is increasingly a recognition of how fundamentally awful the environment is, that a massive proportion of the groundwater is contaminated, which then feeds into the food supply and the drinking water, and it's sort of well recognized. And for years they could make the argument, this is the price of industrialization. The West did this when they were industrializing, Love Canal and the British smog, London fog was not fog, but smog. This is exactly the way to industrialize. But, eventually the Western democracies pushed back against that, put in place controls, recognized this was a pretty big problem. The Chinese are starting to do that as well. And when need be, if, it tends to be for, one-off things, but if they're having an Olympics, say, and they want to have clean air for the athletes, and shut down all the factories within a certain distance of Beijing a month or two before, and it remarkably cleans up the air. That's what a totalitarian regime can do, but that's really probably not the best way of managing things. You don't want to just stop things in a certain area for a month or two. You want it to be at a sustained level of lower emissions and put yourself onto a better track. And so I think China is definitely running into some problems in this area, and it will start taking a bite. It already has started taking a bite out of their productivity. As it starts interrupting how effective workers are. If they start having breathing problems, lung capacity issues, missing days of work, and so on, that's going to put a brake on how rapidly you're able to produce things.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk Chinese economics as foreign policy for just a minute. The Road and Belt Initiative, expansion perhaps in the South China Sea. Can you talk to the economic effectiveness of these ideas? And I think Montenegro is pushing back, having sold its soul to the devil. I'll claim that phrase, but I stole it, I think, from the Post. Can you talk to some of that?
Yeah, and the Chinese have a lot of their goods and a lot of their raw materials come in, as most raw materials come into most countries, by sea. But China doesn't have a big maritime tradition. The US Navy and its allies still rule the waves. India is not exactly the most friendly nation for China. So all the raw materials coming from the Middle East and the oil fields and Africa has to transition areas that there might be some geopolitical tensions, and China lacks the ability to ensure its own freedom of passage for those raw materials, which really are keeping its economy spinning. So finding a way, and they also see, to their mind, and and sometimes you see it in our own documents, a element of the United States seeking to contain China. You know, we've got the alliance with Japan, we've got alliance with South Korea, alliance with Thailand, alliance with the Philippines, and U.S. troops in Afghanistan, closer relations with India. So the Chinese can feel as if they're somewhat encircled in that regard, and that's one that if you had a more suspicious view of American activity, and the communists get pretty suspicious, and you see this as a bit of a problem. So being able to create overland connections for pipelines, for rail, and so forth is a way to continue this flow of raw materials that outflanks what could be an American dominance of the sea lanes, that the Straits of Malacca are no longer the windpipe of the Chinese economy, that if you can get a good number of goods even from ports in Pakistan or Burma or elsewhere, this can give you readier access to the things that can keep your economy going, even in a period of heightened international tensions, and it can more liberate you from this American-centric system. Well, that's one thing. And then, of course, there's a waterborne element as well. They're not selling that out. We see the expansion of the PLA Navy, the creation of islands and other activities that probably have more of a nationalist bent, but they're again expanding the realm of Chinese control and influence, particularly into the South China Sea. But many of those also have a flavor of nationalism to them, that they think of them as, or we think of them as little specks. They have more symbolic value, the senkakus, than to the Chinese than they do to us. It's like the senkakus, it's not just the government of the People's Republic that claims them, the government of the Republic of China, Taiwan, claims them as well. So the People's Republic is hardly going to take second fiddle to its arch rival in Taiwan on issues of that sort.
And I'm reminded, as you talked about the American system of alliances in the Asia-Pacific region, of recent analysis I've seen suggesting that Russia and China are either drawing closer together or being pushed closer together by the Biden administration.
Yeah, I think that might well be what's happening. To the more that we are confrontational with both the Russians and the Chinese, the more they'll find things in common with each other. I think it's a story that ends badly for the Russians. I think they will, if they aren't already, the junior partner in such an arrangement. They only have an extraordinarily small proportion of their population east of the Urals. The Chinese have effectively economically colonized the Far East anyway, and the Russians will and will become increasingly dependent upon China. And China wants raw materials. Russia has raw materials. That's pretty good for the Russians, but they again will get sucked into the Chinese orbit. And the Russians certainly would prefer to be much more autonomous in their orbit. They didn't like getting sucked into the West European American orbit. They're not going to like getting sucked into the Chinese orbit, but they're really stuck between, much more attractive elements on either side than what exists within the Russian space.
And you're suggesting, I think, that they would be the junior partner this time in a way they were not the last time those two countries were closely aligned before.
Correct.
Before things had opened China.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to head now across the Pacific and back home. Our friend Frank Hoffman asks whether debt still matters. He's looking, I think, at the pandemic spending bills. We've seen trillions of dollars in spending over the course of the last year. Talk of a significant infrastructure bill with less talk, or at least less consensus on how to fund it. Does debt still matter?
I don't think so as much. I mean, debt matters, but at the moment we can borrow with inflation effectively zero for quite an extent, out to 10, 20 years. It's very close to free money for the government. They're just dragging the expenditure forward, but without paying an interest rate hit on it. And they haven't for a decade. The other part of it is, and I alluded to this at the beginning, the sort of inequalities that have developed. I think we see a lot, potential capacity for taxation on people at the top end of the spectrum, and for two reasons. Most of the income gains of the last 20 to 30 years have gone to the top few percent. So that's where the, like Willie Sutton in the banks, you go where the money is. Some redistribution to the benefit, you want it to be redistribution in an effective way. You don't want it just to be wasted, but things, the education, infrastructure in a broad sense of providing, more resilient healthcare and educational facilities, worker training, roads and ports and so forth would be pretty beneficial to a lot of people, both directly in terms of the employment effects and then indirectly in terms of making, economic activity more easier to engage in. So in that sense, I would say that it's not the end of, that debt's probably still has some realm to go. You don't want it just to be exploding, I don't think, but usually what you do see is a big surge in inflation, and we just haven't seen that at all. And with unemployment being really what it is, with the high levels of underemployment, it doesn't seem as if the wage pressures are there to translate into higher prices at the moment. And again, it's been that, in fact, we had deflation last year. So I don't see that as a particular, it doesn't seem to be rearing its head. The Fed remains attentive to it, but, you got debt above 100% of GDP, you have big budget deficits, and inflation
for the first time since World War II, or for the first time ever?
I think it's now higher than it was in the Second World War. And you want to get on. I mean, I think we're not looking at a permanent arrangement of bringing on lots more debt. You ultimately want debt to be growing at a slower pace than your economy, but it isn't to say that perhaps now as a jump start for an economy that's been on its back and which could deal with some with historically low interest rates, could probably do with some big infrastructure spending to get a whole array of activities going. And it seems like there's still some room for that. I mean, that would be what I would argue at the moment. It's not that you could do that. You couldn't have an infrastructure package like President Biden's proposing every year for the next 10 years, but you certainly can put this one through, I think.
Well, the ROI would drop, presumably, right? You pick the low-hanging fruit first, and
yeah,
with money and
yeah. I mean, obviously, we need a high-speed rail connection between Carlisle and Philadelphia, but beyond that, I mean,
the fact that would make your weekends more fun does not necessarily make it a national priority. Another question: do you see any threats to the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency?
In the short term, no, but as the renminbi, the yuan internationalizes, the Chinese currency, then you might start seeing some, but some of that depends upon the nature of the Chinese government. And an authoritarian, totalitarian government is not the most reliable of partners. They confiscate things just pretty arbitrarily. You don't have recourse to the courts. They don't have a broad system of alliances and partners. So, if the Chinese would be having to prove themselves a bit more, I think, in terms of the management of their own currency and financial affairs and the rule of law domestically before they could become a big rival to the dollar. I think the Chinese economy itself would, by the nature of its size and its international engagement, might start lending itself that way. But there are other factors that go in that relate to the credibility of the government. Interestingly, within different regions, but they might become a reserve currency or already are within, say, Southeast Asia, in the same way Europe and the euro are within the Balkans and some of the Middle East and West Africa, that so many countries trade with the Europeans that the euro is a de facto reserve currency for them. But as a global reserve currency, one that's good in North Africa and in Vietnam and in China and wherever else, I think the dollar is still, it doesn't have a rival yet.
Bitcoin or cryptocurrency isn't going to replace the dollar either then?
I don't think so. They're still priced in dollars, and when you think of it, you say, "Oh well, it's $50,000 or whatever." You're still thinking in terms of dollars. You don't really buy houses with Bitcoin or your groceries with Bitcoin, or maybe drug dealers might do it, but they, but even then, these sort of illicit activities, Bitcoin is traceable, and that's one of the things with say $100 bills or 500 euro notes. They're not exactly traceable, or gold. You hand them off to someone, whoever has it, but Bitcoin you can track back. And if you're a fairly sophisticated government agency investigating international crime and money laundering, you're able to track Bitcoin and other things. And the audit trail is there. And well, that's an attractive feature for some people who would normally be at the cutting edge of those sorts of activities. And it's a seamy side of a reserve currency, but it's a side nonetheless. That's not so attractive. And the other part of it is you have to think of what are the values of a currency. Well, one's a store of value, and Bitcoin's up 10% one day, down 15% the next. Not really a great store of value. Might be an interesting investment, in the same way Microsoft or Apple stock is an investment, but not as really as a widespread currency. And then not so many people are accepting it. And some countries still retain the ability, don't like it at all and are banning it. So then that makes it difficult. Then finally, Bitcoin and all the other cryptocurrencies depend upon a very well-functioning international IT infrastructure with reliable internet and servers and so forth. And governments are pretty adept at shutting that down when they need to, or isolating that. And we often see the reserve currencies coming up in countries that really hit the skids, Zimbabwe or Venezuela. And if you're having power shortages and you're having trouble getting access to anything, Bitcoin's not going to help you in the way a little thing of gold that's that big might, or a handful of $100 bills.
Well, this has been an awful lot of fun, Mark. I've got a stack more questions to ask you. We've got more questions in the chat, and so delighted to have you here as part of this session. But at this point, it is with regret, I have to turn the microphone back over to Raleigh, who is going to bring us home.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yes, thank you, John, and thank you, Mark. That was really fascinating. And to our audience, if you found it as fascinating as I did, please consider supporting us. Check out our website. There are lots of articles, lots of other events on FPRI's YouTube channel. For a fraction of the costs that you all spend for your cable television each month, you can become a member of FPRI. And I dare say that what we provide is a lot more valuable. I'm parochial about that, but I genuinely believe it. So do consider supporting us. We really appreciate it. Again, thanks to Mark and John. Terrific program, terrific discussion. And to our audience, you all take care and stay safe, and come see us again for our next event. Thank you.